What type of feast was the Feast of Tabernacles? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Deuteronomy on Walking Through the Bible. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Deuteronomy chapter 16. We're going to be reading verses 9 to 17. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Deuteronomy chapter 16, beginning at verse 9. You shall count 7 weeks for yourself. Begin to count the 7 weeks from the time you begin to put the sickle to the grain. Then you shall keep the Feast of Weeks to the Lord your God with a tribute of the freewill offering from your hand, which you shall give as the Lord your God blesses you. You shall rejoice before the Lord, you and your son and your daughter, your male servant and your female servant, the Levite who was within your gates, the stranger and the fatherless and the widow who are among you, at the place where the Lord your God chooses to make his name abide. And you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and you shall be careful to observe these statutes. You shall observe the Feast of Tabernacles 7 days, when you have gathered from your threshing floor and from your winepress. And you shall rejoice in your feast, you and your son and your daughter, your male servant and your female servant, and the Levite, the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow who are within your gates. 7 days you shall keep a sacred feast to the Lord your God, in the place which the Lord chooses, because the Lord your God will bless you in all your produce, and in all the work of your hands, so that you surely rejoice. 3 times a year all your males shall appear before the Lord your God in the place which he chooses, at the Feast of Unleavened Bread, at the Feast of Weeks, and at the Feast of Tabernacles. And they shall not appear before the Lord empty-handed. Every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of the Lord your God which he has given you. In our last lesson, we began to talk about the 3 pilgrimage feasts of the Lord. These feasts are the Feast of Passover, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Tabernacles. The Feast of Passover was a feast to remember the deliverance of the firstborn son in Egypt from the 10th and final plague before the Exodus. Thus, this was a solemn feast that was immediately followed by the Feast of Unleavened Bread, a feast that remembered the actual Exodus from Egypt. Moving on to the Feast of Weeks, we find that this feast was connected to the Feast of Passover in that it would be used as a starting point for determining when the Feast of Weeks was to be observed. It isn't obvious from Deuteronomy, for Moses says here that from the time that Israel began to put the sickle to the grain, that would be the first fruits offering of the barley harvest, they were to count 7 weeks, at which time the Feast of Weeks would be observed. But we do know from Leviticus, the first fruits offering of the barley harvest coincided with the day after the Sabbath following the observance of the Passover. For that, let's read Leviticus 23 verses 4 to 11 and then 15 and 16. These are the feasts of the Lord, holy convocations which you shall proclaim at their appointed times. On the 14th day of the first month at twilight is the Lord's Passover. And on the 15th day of the same month is the Feast of Unleavened Bread to the Lord. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it, but you shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord for 7 days. The 7th day shall be a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, When you come into the land which I give you, and reap its harvest, then you shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest. He shall wave the sheaf before the Lord to be accepted on your behalf. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. Skipping down to verse 15. And you shall count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be completed. Count 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath. Then you shall offer a new grain offering to the Lord. This is why reading a passage in context is so important, for even in Leviticus, if you just read the section about the first fruits offering, we might walk away confused. Which Sabbath is being talked about? But when connected with the Passover observance, that immediately preceded it, and the fact that the Passover coincided with the barley harvest, it is obvious that the first fruits offering occurred during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, on the day following the Sabbath, which we discussed in Leviticus 23 meant the Sunday following the weekly Sabbath that occurred during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The Israelites were thus to use this day to calculate the day for the Feast of Weeks, 7 Sabbaths plus 1 day, meaning 50 days. New Testament readers wouldn't know this feast as the Feast of Weeks, but rather the day of Pentecost, with Pentecost meaning 50. The Feast of Weeks was a feast of thanksgiving and rejoicing which would occur during the wheat harvest, hence why a free will offering, along with other offerings, were to be offered to God. The third pilgrimage feast was the Feast of Tabernacles. Like the Feast of Unleavened Bread, this was a week-long feast. According to Leviticus 23, it occurred on the 15th day of the 7th month, meaning on our calendars it occurred during late September, early October. It was a feast that occurred during the end of the harvest season. So, like the Feast of Weeks, this feast too was a feast of rejoicing and thanksgiving, but was extended in order to show thankfulness for all that God had done for them throughout the year and throughout their history. From our other studies, we also know that it commemorated when Israel dwelt in booths, and thus they were to be thankful for God's provisions for them at that time, and thankful that God provided them permanent dwellings in Israel. It can be said then that the solemn feast of the Lord, this was the most joyous feast of them all, the Feast of Tabernacles, especially since what came before it 5 days earlier was the Day of Atonement, when Israel would be reminded of their sins. When we examine these feasts then, God didn't demand that Israel pilgrimage to where he placed his name in order to punish them or waste their time. No, these feasts were meant to bring to mind all that God had done for them, and thus, along with the sacrifices that were to be offered at these feasts, as outlined in the book of Numbers, each person was to bring, as they were able, a portion of what the Lord had blessed them with, as a sign of their gratitude. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Deuteronomy chapter 16, verses 18 to 22, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time.
Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.